The letter arrived at the Beaumont County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in March of 1873, and the clerk who received it, a thin man named Aldous Price, read it twice before he understood what it asked. The letter was from a woman named Clara Marsh, widow of Thomas Eli Marsh of Cutter Creek, Wyoming Territory, and it asked whether the court held any record of a man named John Wayne, formerly of Abilene, Kansas, who might have had dealings with the county in the years between 1865 and 1870. The handwriting was careful and even, the kind taught in Eastern schoolrooms before war and distance made such neatness a luxury. The paper was good stock. The woman who wrote it had been educated and had not forgotten it, whatever else she had lost. Aldous Price filed the letter in the third drawer of his cabinet, beneath a stack of delinquent tax notices, and thought no more about it. He did not know that Clara Marsh had already been riding for 11 days. The spring of 1873 was wet and cold in the Basin country between the Powder River and the Black Hills, the kind of spring that promised nothing and delivered mud. The winter had come down hard from Canada in November, piling snow against the fence lines and freezing the stock tanks solid by Christmas. By February, the smaller operations along Cutter Creek were already in trouble. Hay gone, cattle thin, creditors sending men in wagons instead of letters. The big outfits, the ones that had been running cattle since before the railroad came through, weathered it with reserves and hired hands and the particular patience of men who had seen hard winters before. But the smaller ones, the quarter-section claims and the homestead parcels filed under the Act of 1862, those were bleeding from a dozen small wounds that the spring thaw would not close. Thomas Eli Marsh had worked 160 acres on the South Fork of Cutter Creek for 9 years. He had come up from Missouri in 1864, a young man with a government land patent and $200 in savings, and he had built everything on that ground: the house, the barn, the fences, the small apple orchard he planted on the eastern slope because his mother had kept one in Boonville, and he had not forgotten the smell of it in bloom. He ran 60 head of mixed cattle and kept a kitchen garden, and sold cordwood in the autumn when the timber buyers came through from Casper. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who had made something from almost nothing, which in 1873 in the Wyoming Territory was not the same as being poor. He had been dead since November. The fever took him in 3 days. Clara had sent for the doctor in Beaumont, 14 miles east, but the roads were already bad, and the doctor did not arrive until Thomas had been gone for a day and a half. She buried him in the frozen ground at the edge of the apple orchard with the help of their neighbor, a Norwegian named Sven Halvorsen, who dug the hole himself and said a few words in Norwegian, and then a few in English, and then stood with his hat in his hands for a long time before he walked home. Clara was 31 years old. She had 2 daughters, Ruth, who was 9, and Pearl, who was 6. She had $47 in the household tin, a paid-up account at the Beaumont Mercantile through the end of February, and a note on the property held by the Beaumont Savings and Loan Association in the amount of $212, due in full on the first day of June. That was the world Clara Marsh inherited in November of 1872, on the 3rd day after the fever took her husband. She managed through the winter. That is the only way to say it, and it says very little. Managing through a Wyoming winter with 2 young daughters and a note coming due and 60 head of cattle to feed is a thing that uses a person up in ways that do not show until the thaw. She sold 14 head in December to a buyer from Sheridan who paid her $31 for the lot and seemed to consider himself generous. She cut wood herself on the good days, splitting it by the barn and stacking it under the lean-to where it would stay dry. Ruth helped with the cattle in the mornings before school, walking the fence line with the kind of seriousness that 9-year-old girls develop when they understand that seriousness is required. Pearl fed the chickens and did not complain about the cold, which Clara noticed and was grateful for without finding the words to say so. The note on the property was the thing that did not leave her thoughts. $212, due June 1st. She had spoken to Gordon Hatch, the manager of the Beaumont Savings and Loan, in January, riding the 14 miles in, on a day when the temperature had climbed above freezing, for the first time in 3 weeks. Gordon Hatch was a short, pale man who kept his office warm and wore a wool vest even in summer, and had a way of looking at a person over the top of his spectacles that managed to convey both sympathy and the complete irrelevance of that sympathy to the matter at hand. He expressed his condolences regarding Thomas. He noted that the note was in Thomas's name, and that the transfer of liability to Clara, as surviving spouse, was a matter of legal record and not subject to renegotiation of terms. He suggested that if Clara found herself unable to meet the June 1st obligation, the bank would of course proceed through its standard process, which meant a notice of default, a period of 30 days, and then a public auction of the property and its improvements. He said all of this in the same tone a man uses when he explains that the weather has been dry. Clara rode home in the cold and did not speak to anyone about it for 2 weeks. Then she began writing letters. She wrote to Thomas's brother in Kansas City, a man named Gerald Marsh, who replied after 6 weeks to say that he was sorry for her trouble and that he was himself in a difficult position financially and could not be of assistance at this time. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office inquiring about any relief provisions for widowed homesteaders and received back a form letter that explained no such provisions existed. She wrote to a law office in Cheyenne, whose advertisement she had clipped from a newspaper, and received no reply at all. In February, she went through Thomas's papers looking for anything she might have missed. A policy, a certificate, a savings account she had not known about. Thomas had kept his papers in a cedar box under the bed, and she went through every document in it over the course of 2 evenings at the kitchen table while the girls slept. There were the land patents and the deed and the note itself, copied in Thomas's hand. There was his discharge paper from the Missouri militia, dated 1863. There were receipts from the mercantile going back 7 years, bundled with a piece of kitchen twine. There were 2 letters from his mother, both written before the war. There was a photograph of Thomas at about 20 years old, standing very straight in front of something Clara could not identify in the background. And there was his Bible. It was a small Bible, black cover, worn at the spine. Thomas had not been a church-going man in the formal sense, but he had kept the Bible on the nightstand and read from it occasionally in a quiet, private way that Clara had never questioned. She opened it out of habit, the way one opens a familiar book, and a folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages of the Psalms. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a wanted poster, or rather, it was a hand-copied version of one. Thomas had written it out himself, she could tell by the handwriting, in careful block letters on a piece of paper that had been folded so many times it was soft at the creases. At the top it said, in Thomas's careful hand, "Wanted for questioning, John Wayne, Abilene, Kansas, 1867. Below that was a physical description: 6 feet 3 inches tall, broad through the shoulders, square jaw, dark hair gone gray at the temples, carries himself quiet. Below the description, Thomas had written a single sentence in his ordinary cursive: "This man saved my life, and I never thanked him." Below that, in smaller letters, a note to himself, or to no one: "Find him if you can." Clara read it 3 times. Then she folded it exactly as Thomas had folded it and placed it back between the pages of the Psalms and set the Bible on the nightstand on Thomas's side of the bed, which she had not touched since November. She did not sleep well that night. What Thomas had not written down, but what Clara knew from 9 years of marriage, and the particular way Thomas went quiet sometimes when certain things came up, was the outline of the story. She had heard pieces of it over the years. A night in Abilene in 1867, when things had gone badly wrong for Thomas, when he had been set upon by 3 men in an alley behind a stock pen's office, Men who wanted the $60 he'd been paid that afternoon for a cattle drive he'd completed from Missouri. She knew that someone had intervened. She knew that Thomas had been saved from something he never named directly but described around the edges, in the way men describe things they are ashamed of having needed rescue from. She had not known the name of the man who helped him. She had not known Thomas had tried to find out. She lay in the dark for a long time. Then she thought about the $212 and the first day of June, and Ruth's serious face in the cold morning light walking the fence line, and Pearl not complaining, and she made a decision that she recognized even as she was making it, as possibly the most unreasonable thing she had ever done. She would find the man. It took her a week to arrange things. Sven Halverson agreed to look after the cattle and the property, shaking his head slowly as she explained what she intended but making no argument, because he had known Clara for 6 years and understood that arguing with her was a thing done by people who had not met her yet. His wife, Ingrid, agreed to take the girls, and Pearl cried and Ruth did not, which reversed what Clara might have predicted. She packed a saddlebag with 4 days of food, a change of clothes, her $47 in the household tin, and Thomas's Bible with the folded paper inside it. She kissed both girls and rode east in the early morning of March the 8th, 1873, with the ground still frozen and the sky the color of pewter, and the apple orchard standing bare and silent on the eastern slope behind her. She had no plan beyond the name and the year and the description. 6 feet 3 inches, broad, quiet, and a direction, which was south and east, toward the cattle country where a man like that might still be working. John Wayne had come to Beaumont County from the north, riding down from the Powder River country on the 14th of March, 1873, with 3 days of trail dirt on him and a commission in his coat pocket from a rancher named August Grunwald, who ran cattle on 12,000 acres near Buffalo and needed a man who knew the southern grazing ground to scout pasture conditions ahead of the spring drive. It was the kind of work John Wayne did in the years after he'd left the regular cattle trade. Not a hired hand's work exactly, not a foreman's work exactly, but the work of a man with enough history in the territory that people paid him to know things and trusted that he did. He was 51 years old in the spring of 1873. He had been many things before that: a cavalry scout in the final years of the war, a trail boss on 3 drives out of Texas in the late 60s, a deputy marshal in Abilene for 14 months in 1867 and 1868, before he decided that a badge made people come at you sideways, and he preferred problems that came straight on. He had run his own small operation on the Cimarron for 2 years in the early 70s, before a drought and a bad winter took the herd down to nothing, and he had sold the land for enough to settle his debts and ridden north without looking back at the place. He was not a man who looked back at places. He stood 6 feet 3 inches in his boots, broad across the shoulders in a way that had not diminished with the years, with a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's tool, and eyes that sat deep under a brow that seemed permanently set against some distant point. His Stetson was high-crowned and dark with sweat at the band. His vest was leather, worn pale at the edges. He moved through a room the way a large piece of the landscape moves through it, slowly, inevitably, and without particular interest in what anyone else thought about it. He took a room at the only hotel in Beaumont, a 2-story frame building called the Prairie Rest that smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool, and served a passable breakfast at 6 in the morning. He ate alone at a corner table both mornings he was there, reading the week-old newspaper the proprietor kept on the dining room sideboard, drinking black coffee, and speaking to no one except to order more coffee, which he did with a small gesture of his cup rather than words. He planned to be in Beaumont 2 days, 3 at most. He needed to speak with the land office about grazing lease records, pick up the supply order Grunwald had telegraphed ahead to the mercantile, and get a reliable weather report from the men who ran cattle in the southern end of the county. It was straightforward work. He had done it many times. On the afternoon of his second day in Beaumont, he was coming out of the land office on the main street when he heard a woman's voice at the steps of the Beaumont Savings and Loan, which was 3 buildings down and across the street. He heard it not because she was shouting, she was not shouting, but because there was something in the register of the voice that carried, a controlled voice, the voice of a person keeping a very tight hold on something. The note says June 1st, she was saying to a pale man in a wool vest who stood in the doorway of the Savings and Loan. That is 63 days from today. I am asking for the payment to be received in installments, not forgiven. I am asking for the bank to accept partial payments against the principal through May, and the remainder on June 1st. Gordon Hatch, for it was Gordon Hatch, in his doorway, with his spectacles, looked at her over the top of those spectacles in the way he had. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "the note does not provide for installment payment. The terms are clear. I have no authority to alter them." "Then who does have authority?" "The board of directors meets quarterly. Their next meeting is in July." Nobody moved on that sidewalk for a long moment. John Wayne stood on the other side of the street and watched. He was not a man who inserted himself quickly into other people's difficulties. He had learned over 51 years that what looks like an injustice from a distance is sometimes a complication that closer examination reveals to be less simple. And he had also learned that leaping across a street to intervene in a conversation between a banker and a woman was not without its own complications. He stood and he watched and he listened, which was what he did before he did anything else. The woman was maybe 30, maybe a little older. It was hard to say with women who worked hard land, because the work aged the face but not the eyes, and her eyes were clear and direct and not afraid of Gordon Hatch or his spectacles. She was dressed for travel, not for town. A heavy coat, boots with trail mud still on them, a horse tied at the rail behind her that had come a distance. Her jaw was set. She had red-brown hair that the wind off the street was pulling at. She held a saddlebag over one shoulder, and she was not going to cry, not in front of Gordon Hatch, possibly not anywhere. She said something else that John Wayne could not hear from across the street, and Gordon Hatch shook his head, and she turned and came down the steps of the Savings and Loan and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her back to the building, and looked at the street without seeing it. John Wayne did not move. He watched her collect herself. It took about 4 seconds. Then she straightened and walked toward the hotel. He went back into the land office. He was there for 40 minutes, going through the grazing lease records with the clerk, writing down the parcel numbers Grunewald needed. He thought about August Grunewald's spring drive and the condition of the southern pastures, and what the wet spring might mean for the grass in the bottomlands. He wrote down what he needed and thanked the clerk and left. He walked to the hotel and went to the dining room and ordered coffee and sat at the corner table. Clara Marsh was sitting at the table near the window. She had a cup of coffee in front of her and Thomas's Bible on the table beside it, and she was reading something. A piece of paper, folded, which she refolded and placed back in the Bible when she saw that she was not alone. She was not looking at John Wayne. She was looking out the window at the street. He looked at her once. Then he looked at his coffee. He sat there for perhaps 20 minutes. He heard her ask the proprietor's wife for a second cup of coffee. He heard her thank the woman. He did not look up. Then she said, to no one, obviously, "I beg your pardon. Are you by any chance acquainted with this county?" He looked up. Her eyes were gray. She was looking at him directly, which was a thing most people did not do, not right away, not with a first question. Most people eased into looking at John Wayne, the way you ease into cold water. He said, "Well enough." She said, "I'm looking for a man. I've been told he may have worked this country at some point. His name is John Wayne." The dining room was quiet enough that the fire in the kitchen was audible. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her for a moment. Not warily, he was not a wary man, but carefully, The way you look at something that has arrived unexpectedly, and you are deciding what it means. I've heard the name, he said. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already half decided. She said, My husband knew him years ago, in Abilene. My husband passed away in November. I found something in his Bible. She touched the cover of the book on the table beside her coffee. He'd written down a description, a wanted poster, not a real one. He'd copied it himself from somewhere, or made it up. It said wanted for questioning. It said this man saved his life and he never thanked him. She paused. I think he intended to find him someday, and failed to, so I thought I would try. John Wayne said nothing for a moment. Then he said, What's your name? Clara Marsh. Thomas Marsh was my husband. Cutter Creek, Wyoming Territory. Tom Marsh, he said quietly. Missouri boy. Drove cattle up from Kansas City. She went very still. You knew him. He looked at her evenly. I knew a Tom Marsh. In Abilene, 67. Then you're him. He did not deny it, and he did not confirm it, which was the same as confirming it. She looked at him for a long moment. Thomas wrote that you saved his life. Men in alleys don't always need saving, he said. Sometimes they just need another man to walk into the alley. Changes the arithmetic. She absorbed this, she said. He never forgot it. He said nothing. She said, I came because Thomas wanted to find you and couldn't. I thought, she stopped. She looked out the window. I thought I owed it to him to find you and tell you that he was grateful, that he thought about it, that he kept your name. She touched the Bible again. He kept your name in his Bible. John Wayne was quiet for a long time. Then he said, What was the number? The note on your property. She looked back at him. Something moved in her expression. How did you know about the note? I was across the street this afternoon, he said. I heard part of it. She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled in the kitchen. Then she said, $212, due June 1st. How much do you have? The directness of the question did not seem to offend her. She said, $47. I've been riding 11 days trying to find work or a buyer for some timber rights on the northeast corner of the property. I haven't found either. He nodded slowly. He stood up. He said, Come with me. She looked up at him. He was very tall, standing in the low-ceilinged dining room, and she said after a moment, Where? He said, The savings and loan. She stood up. She picked up the Bible. She said, Mr. Wayne, the bank closes in 20 minutes. He said, I know. The afternoon light in Beaumont in March was thin and slanted, coming in low off the eastern plains and laying itself across the main street at an angle that made the mud in the ruts glow copper and the false fronts of the buildings cast shadows longer than they deserved. John Wayne walked without hurrying across the street to the Beaumont Savings and Loan, with Clara Marsh keeping pace beside him, not speaking, her saddlebag still over her shoulder and the Bible under her arm. He held the door and she went in. Gordon Hatch was behind the teller window talking to his single clerk about closing the cage. He looked up when the door opened, and his expression when he saw Clara Marsh returned contained the particular weariness of a man who had already done this thing once today and had considered it concluded. Then his eyes moved to the man who had come in with her, and something shifted in the quality of his weariness. He knew John Wayne by reputation. Most men in the cattle country of Wyoming Territory knew John Wayne by reputation. He had been known in this country for the better part of a decade as a man of considerable probity and considerably less patience for the kind of maneuver that dressed itself in the language of legal obligation. Mr. Hatch, John Wayne said. He did not move toward the window quickly. He moved toward it at his own pace, which was the pace of a man who knows the ground will still be there when he reaches it. Mr. Wayne, Gordon Hatch said. I'd like to pay off a note, John Wayne said. Gordon Hatch looked at him. He looked at Clara Marsh. He looked back at John Wayne. "Against what property?" he said. 160 acres on the South Fork of Cutter Creek, held in the name of Thomas Eli Marsh, deceased, with liability transferred to his widow, Clara Marsh. He turned to Clara. "Is that the right legal description?" She had gone very still. She said quietly, "That's correct." Gordon Hatch opened his mouth and then closed it and then said, "The note is $212. "I know what the note is," John Wayne said. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and brought out a leather wallet that was worn at the fold from considerable use, and opened it on the counter. He laid out bills. They were large bills, the kind that come from a bank and have not been circulated much, and he laid them out with care, one at a time, onto the wooden counter of the teller window. He counted them as he laid them down. 100, he said, and laid the bill. The clerk at the cage had stopped what he was doing and was watching. 150, another bill. 200. He paused and looked at Gordon Hatch. 212. He laid a 10 and then added 2 singles, and then looked at the amount again and reached back into the wallet. "And 20 more, he said, "for any fees the bank has seen fit to accumulate against the account." He laid the bills flat on the counter and did not touch them again. The clerk behind Hatch was looking at the money with the expression of a man who has counted money his whole working life and finds it no less significant for that. Gordon Hatch looked at the bills. He said, "I'll need to verify the account." "Verify it," John Wayne said. Nobody in that room moved while Gordon Hatch went to his records. The clerk stood at the edge of the cage looking at John Wayne with the careful attention of someone who understands he is watching something that will be worth remembering. Clara Marsh stood to John Wayne's left with the Bible under her arm and her eyes on the counter where the money lay. She had not spoken since the correct legal description. Hatch came back with the account ledger. He opened it on the counter. He reviewed the entry. He looked at the money. He said, "The outstanding balance as of today is $212. These funds are sufficient," John Wayne said. "Yes," Gordon Hatch said, "they are." He gathered the bills. He counted them himself, twice, with the deliberate care of a man who understands that errors in his favor will not be welcomed. He wrote a figure in the ledger. He reached under the counter and brought out a receipt book and wrote out a receipt in his small, precise hand. Received in full payment of note against property described as 160 acres South Fork Cutter Creek, account of Thomas Eli Marsh. He wrote the date, March 14, 1873. He wrote the amount, $232. He wrote the notation, "Note satisfied, no further obligation." He stamped it with the bank's stamp and signed it, and slid it across the counter. John Wayne picked it up and turned and held it out to Clara Marsh. She took it. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The clerk observed later to his wife that the widow looked at that piece of paper the way a person looks at a thing they were not sure they would ever see and had stopped allowing themselves to picture. She said very quietly, "I can't. Mr. Wayne, I cannot." "It's done," he said. "The amount, I don't know when I could." "Mrs. Marsh," he said, and he said it in the way he said most things, low and unhurried, with a finality that was not unkind. "Tom Marsh walked a long trail to build that place. It ought to stay where he built it." She pressed her lips together. She held the receipt with both hands. The clerk would remember afterward that she did not cry. He would tell this to his wife, and she would find it significant. He said the widow held that paper and looked at it and did not cry, but her knuckles were white. John Wayne turned to Gordon Hatch. "I'll want a copy of that notation for the county deed record." Hatch nodded. "I'll send it to the courthouse in the morning." "Today," John Wayne said, not a request. He did not wait for an answer. Hatch looked at the clock on the wall. He looked at his clerk. He looked back at John Wayne. He said, "Today." John Wayne put his wallet back in his vest pocket. He touched the brim of his hat to Gordon Hatch in a gesture that conveyed neither warmth nor hostility, just acknowledgement of a transaction completed. He turned and walked toward the door. Clara Marsh said, "Mr. Wayne." He stopped with his hand on the door. She said, "Thomas would have wanted to do this himself, finding you, saying what he meant to say." He stood with his hand on the door for a moment. He said, without turning around, "I know it." Then he went out. The door fell closed behind him with a small, final sound. Clara Marsh stood in the Beaumont Savings and Loan with the paid receipt in her hands and the Bible under her arm, and looked at the closed door for a long time. Gordon Hatch stood behind his counter looking at her. The clerk stood in the cage looking at his ledger, as though it had suddenly become very interesting. After a moment, Clara said to no one in particular, "Is there a notary in this building?" Hatch said, "I am one." She said, "Then I would like the receipt notarized, please." She paid him 50 cents for the notarization. She watched him stamp it and sign it again in his capacity as notary public for Beaumont County. She folded it once and placed it inside Thomas's Bible, alongside the piece of paper with Thomas's careful block letters and the description of a tall man who carried himself quiet. She went out into the late afternoon light. John Wayne's horse was gone from the rail where it had been standing when she came into town. The street was ordinary, the same street it had been 2 hours ago, with the mud drying at the ruts and the thin spring light going gold at the edges. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she went to the hotel and arranged to send a telegram to Ingrid Halverson, saying she would be home by the 20th, and asked the proprietor's wife if she might have a bath before supper, which was granted. She ate supper that evening in the hotel dining room at the corner table that John Wayne had vacated, and she ate everything on her plate, which she had not done at a meal in 4 months, and ordered a piece of pie, which she also finished. She went upstairs to the room she had paid for and sat on the edge of the bed with Thomas's Bible in her lap. She thought about Thomas, and the alley in Abilene in 1867, and the way he had kept a name in his Bible for 6 years. She thought about what it meant to carry gratitude that long without a place to put it. She thought about the look on John Wayne's face when she told him what Thomas had written. It was not surprise exactly, and it was not dismissal exactly. It was the look of a man receiving something he does not quite know how to hold but will not refuse. She thought, Thomas would have liked that man. She thought, I wrote 11 days to say thank you on behalf of a dead man, and the dead man's debt was paid before I could say anything else. She opened the Bible to the Psalms and looked at the 2 papers lying side by side, the wanted poster in Thomas's block letters, and the receipt from the Beaumont Savings and Loan, notarized and stamped, bearing the date of March the 14th, 1873, and the notation, "No further obligation." She placed her hand on them and said, "To Thomas and to the empty room, I found him." Then she lay down and slept in a way she had not slept since November. The town of Beaumont talked about it for weeks. The clerk at the Savings and Loan, whose name was Oliver Webb, told his wife that evening, and his wife told the women at the Thursday Sewing Circle the following week, and the women at the Sewing Circle told their husbands, and by the end of March there was not a business owner on the main street of Beaumont who had not heard some version of what had happened in the Savings and Loan on the 14th of March. The versions varied in their particulars. Some had the amount as $300, some had it as $500. One version circulating near the livery stable had John Wayne laying the money down in gold coin, which was not what happened but was harder to argue against once it had been said enough times. What Oliver Webb told his wife, which was what had actually happened, was this. The man came in quiet. He didn't look at Hatch like he was angry. He didn't look at anyone like they'd done something wrong. He looked at the counter and he put the money down and he counted it out loud, and then he stood there while Hatch went for the ledger, and he was the stillest large man Oliver Webb had ever seen. Like he had all the time in the world, Oliver told his wife. Like nothing in that room was going to move him before he was ready to move. Oliver Webb was 22 years old. He kept the savings and loan job for 2 more years, and then left Beaumont to study law in Cheyenne. He became an attorney and practiced for 30 years in Wyoming Territory and the state of Wyoming, and in that time he acted, twice, in cases involving widowed homesteaders and mortgage notes, as an advocate rather than a creditor's agent. He said, when asked about it once in 1901, that he had decided somewhere around the age of 22 that there was a difference between what the law said and what the law was for, and that it was a person's business to know the difference. He did not name John Wayne when he said this, but he thought about him. The word reached other parts of the county in the following weeks as well. Ben Kramer, who ran the Beaumont Mercantile and had been cutting Clara Marsh's credit line in increments since January in anticipation of the note default and the property auction, restored her full account 3 days after the news reached him and sent a note to Cutter Creek with the supply wagon saying her account was in good standing and he would be pleased to continue the Marsh family's business. It was a small gesture and not an entirely selfless one, but it meant that Clara did not have to negotiate from weakness for her spring seed order, which had been what she feared next on the list of things the winter had made difficult. Gordon Hatch, for his part, noted the transaction in the bank's records in full compliance with every relevant regulation and sent the copy to the courthouse as instructed that same afternoon, which required him to dispatch his clerk on foot in the last of the daylight, a thing the clerk did not mind at all. Hatch did not discuss the transaction publicly. He was not a man who discussed his business, but he noted it in his private ledger with an extra notation he was not required to make, which said simply, "Note paid in full by third party. No encumbrance." Clara Marsh left Beaumont on the morning of March the 15th and rode the 11 days back to Cutter Creek, arriving on the 26th. 2 days later than she'd told Ingrid Halverson, because she stopped for a day and a half at a property 40 miles out that she'd heard had timber rights available, and negotiated a small but useful arrangement with the owner, involving the sale of standing timber on his northeast section, which provided her with enough additional income to cover the spring operating costs she'd been worrying about since February. She arrived home with the receipt from the savings and loan, $23 remaining in cash, a signed timber rights agreement, and a specific and complete understanding of what the next 12 months required of her. Ruth met her at the gate and took her horse without being asked, and did not let go of the bridle until Clara had dismounted and hugged her. Pearl cried, finally, having apparently been saving it. Ingrid Halverson had made soup. Clara did not tell the girls that night what had happened in Beaumont. She told Sven Halverson, briefly, in the barn while he helped her put the horse up. He listened and nodded and said, in the careful English he used when he was being precise, "A good man, then." Clara said, "Yes." Sven said, "Thomas knew good men." Clara said, "He did." She went inside and had soup with her daughters, and that night she moved Thomas's Bible from the nightstand to the bookshelf in the sitting room where the family books were kept, because it was a family thing now, not a private grief, and she thought Thomas would have agreed. By the first day of June, 1873, which had been the day the note was due and which arrived with warm weather and the apple orchard in bloom for the first time since Thomas had planted it, the trees had been too young the previous spring, Clara Marsh had 44 head of cattle in good condition, a kitchen garden planted, 4 cords of wood sold to a buyer from Casper, and nothing owing to the Beaumont savings and loan. She stood at the edge of the orchard on the morning of June 1st and looked at the trees in bloom and thought, Thomas would have wanted to see this. She thought he probably did see it, in whatever way the dead see the things they planted. She went inside and made breakfast for her daughters. A year later, in the spring of 1874, Clara Marsh had built the herd back to 58 head, which was nearly where it had been when Thomas died. The winter of 1873 to 1874 had been mild by Wyoming standards, cold enough with the usual weeks of hard freeze, but nothing like the catastrophe of the previous year, and she came through it with the cattle in reasonable condition and enough hay in the barn to have sold a small surplus to the Halversons in February when their own supply ran short. She had hired a hand for the spring and summer of 1873, a young man from Nebraska named Calvin Pruitt, who was 17 and very willing and learned quickly, and she paid him $11 a month and his meals, which stretched her but not past what she could manage. Calvin came back in 1874 and asked for 12, which she paid. He stayed 4 years and left when he married a girl from Sheridan, and by then Ruth was old enough to help with the work he'd been doing. In the summer of 1875, 2 years after March of 1873, Clara rode into Beaumont for the quarterly supply run and stopped at the Savings and Loan. She did not need anything from the Savings and Loan. She went in and asked Oliver Webb, who was still at the teller's window, whether the bank offered savings accounts for individual depositors, and he said yes, and she opened one with $60, which was the most money she had ever deposited at one time in her life. She told Oliver Webb her name, and he said, "I remember you, Mrs. Marsh," and did not say anything else, just counted her $60 and wrote out a deposit slip. She kept that account for the next 30 years. Ruth Marsh was 9 years old in the spring of 1873, which meant she was old enough to understand that something important had happened when her mother came back from Beaumont, and old enough to not entirely understand what it was. She knew her mother had found someone. She knew the note was paid. She knew her mother had placed Thomas's Bible on the family bookshelf with the particular deliberateness of someone completing a thing. When she was 14, Ruth asked her mother directly what had happened in Beaumont, and Clara told her, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening with the lamp lit and the Bible open between them. She showed Ruth the 2 papers, the wanted poster in Thomas's block letters and the receipt stamped with the bank's seal. She read Thomas's sentence aloud. "This man saved my life, and I never thanked him." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She said, "So he saved Papa, and then he saved us." And Clara said, "He said it was Tom's place, and it ought to stay where Tom built it." Ruth was quiet again. Then she said, "Did he know who you were when you walked into the hotel?" Clara said, "No." Ruth thought about this. She said, "So he did it just because it was the right thing?" Clara said, "Yes." Ruth Marsh grew up on the Cutter Creek property and married a man named Daniel Finch in 1886, and they ran the property together with Clara until Clara died in 1911 at the age of 69 in the same house Thomas had built in 1864 with both her daughters beside her. Pearl had married and moved to Casper but came home for the last weeks. The apple orchard had grown to 18 trees by then and produced more fruit than they could use, and Clara had been selling the surplus at the Beaumont Farmers Market every August for 20 years. Daniel and Ruth raised 3 children on the Cutter Creek property. The eldest was a boy named Thomas Daniel Finch, after both his grandfather and his father, and he was the one who, in 1891, when he was 8 years old, heard the story of John Wayne and the Beaumont Savings and Loan for the first time from his grandmother Clara, sitting in the kitchen on a winter afternoon with snow on the windows and the lamp lit. Clara told it plainly, the way she told all true things. She did not add to it or ornament it. She showed him the 2 papers in the Bible. She said, "Your great-grandfather was grateful to a man his whole life and never got to say so, and the man, when he found out about it, paid what needed to be paid and walked away without asking for anything in return." Young Thomas Finch was 8, but he was a serious 8, the kind that runs in some families, and he looked at the 2 papers for a long time. He said, "Why did Papa keep a wanted poster on someone he liked?" Clara said, "He made it himself. He wrote it down so he'd remember the details. He called it wanted for questioning because he wanted to find the man and ask him something." "What did he want to ask him?" Clara said, "I think he wanted to ask him why he did it, why he walked into that alley." "What's the answer?" Clara looked at her grandson for a moment. She said, "The answer is what he did in the savings and loan in 1873. That's the same answer. He's that kind of man." Thomas Daniel Finch thought about this for a long time. He became a veterinarian. He practiced in Beaumont County for 31 years and charged whatever people could pay, which was sometimes very little, and in 3 documented cases over those 30 years, charged nothing at all for considerable work, explaining when asked that there were debts that traveled through families and came due in ways nobody planned. He kept the Bible. By the time John Wayne's name had passed through enough hands and years to become something the territory spoke about carefully, the way it spoke about a few other names, carefully, with the particular respect reserved for men whose deeds exceeded their desire for credit, by that time, what the territory knew about him was already more story than record. He had gone back to the Grunewald Ranch after Beaumont in the spring of 1873, and completed the scouting work he'd been commissioned for, and departed north without having spoken much to anyone about what had happened in the county seat. August Grunewald heard about it from his foreman, who heard it from a teamster, who heard it from a man who'd stopped at the Prairie Rest Hotel in Beaumont 2 weeks after the event, and heard it from the proprietor's wife. Grunewald was a taciturn German with a well-developed sense of what things were worth, and he said nothing to John Wayne about it, which he correctly understood was what was wanted. He kept John Wayne on for 2 more seasons and paid him well, and told anyone who asked that he was the most reliable man he'd employed in 15 years in the territory. That recommendation traveled. There were other things John Wayne did in those years, in the cattle country of Wyoming and Montana and the borderlands of the Dakotas, other moments when his path crossed someone in difficulty, and he applied the same quiet arithmetic: assess, decide, act, leave. None of them were announced. A few of them were remembered. One of them, an incident in the autumn of 1876 near a town called Medicine Bow, involved a schoolteacher named Agnes Forster who had been dismissed without wages, owed by a school board that found her too forthcoming in her opinions, and who found an envelope under the door of her boarding house one morning with 4 months of back wages in it and no note. She spent the rest of her life in Medicine Bow and taught there until 1908, and she did not know with certainty who had left the envelope, but she had a clear enough idea to have mentioned the name once, in 1895, to a young woman who was deciding whether to take the teaching position in that town. She said, "There are men in this country who keep a certain kind of account in their own minds, and from time to time they settle what they see as an outstanding balance. You rarely see them do it. You see what they've done after." The young woman took the position. She taught in Medicine Bow for 22 years. In the summer of 1891, the deed to the Cutter Creek property was transferred from Clara Marsh to Ruth Marsh Finch and Daniel Finch, a routine transaction of the kind that happens in every county every year. The deed was recorded in the Beaumont County Register on July the 8th, 1891. At the top of the transfer document, as required by law, was the legal history of the property, which included the notation made in March of 1873. Note satisfied, paid in full by third party. The deputy recorder who filed the document that summer was a young woman named Harriet Cole, and she noticed the notation and thought it unusual. She looked at the date, 1873, and the amount, $232, and the third-party designation, which did not include a name in the bank record as transmitted to the county, and she made a note in her own ledger, in the margin, that she would ask about it sometime. She asked Ruth Finch about it 2 months later when Ruth came in to pick up the transferred deed. Ruth told her. Harriet Cole wrote it down, the full account, as Ruth knew it from Clara, in the margin of her personal ledger, and then crossed out the margin and wrote it out fresh on a separate page, because the margin wasn't wide enough. That page survived. It is in the Beaumont County Historical Archive, donated in 1947 by Harriet Cole's daughter, along with a collection of her mother's papers. The page is labeled in Harriet Cole's hand, Account of John Wayne, Beaumont, March 1873, as told by Ruth Marsh Finch, September 1891. The page is 6 paragraphs long and accurate in every particular that can be checked against the bank's surviving records and Clara Marsh's own account, written down in 1905 at the request of a local historian and preserved alongside the deed in the Finch family papers. Clara's account ends with a sentence that she may have written more than once in other places, because her grandson Thomas found a version of it in a letter she had written to her sister in Missouri in 1874, before the sister died, and another version on the flyleaf of a book of hymns she had kept beside the Bible. It reads, "He did not do it for Thomas, and he did not do it for me, and he did not do it to be thanked. He did it because the land belonged to someone who had built it and earned it, and should not lose it for the want of a sum of money that was, to him, possible. That is all. That is sufficient. That is, I think, what honor looks like when it has no audience." Thomas Eli Marsh's Bible is in the Beaumont County Historical Society's collection, as of the last count taken in 2003. The 2 papers are still inside it, protected now behind archival sleeves, the wanted poster in Thomas's block letters, soft at the folds from being opened and refolded across many years, and the receipt from the Beaumont Savings and Loan, dated March the 14th, 1873, notarized and stamped, with the notation that was not required but was made. No further obligation. The apple orchard on the South Fork of Cutter Creek was still standing in 1961 when a man from the Wyoming State Historical Survey documented it as part of a study on early homestead plantings. He counted 11 of the original trees still living, which he described as remarkable given their age. He noted in his report that the property had remained in the same family line for 88 years. Ruth Finch's granddaughter, a woman named Clara Finch, named for the grandmother she had never met, was living in the house in 1961 and showed the surveyor the deed and the Bible and the 2 papers inside it. He photographed them. The photographs are in the state archive. Clara Finch told the surveyor she had grown up knowing the story the way she had grown up knowing the layout of the house, not as something told to her formally, but as something that was simply there, in the walls and the objects and the way her mother spoke about certain things. She said she had always understood, without being instructed to, that the land they lived on had been paid for twice, once by Thomas Marsh with 9 years of labor, and once by a tall, quiet man who had walked into a savings and loan in March of 1873 and laid $232 on a counter because he thought the arithmetic required it. The surveyor asked her if she knew anything more about John Wayne, what had become of him, where he'd gone after. She said she knew he'd worked the northern cattle country for several more years. She'd heard he went to Montana in the late 70s. She'd heard he was gone by the middle of the 80s, in the way some men of that generation were gone, not dramatically, not with a particular event attached, just gradually past the point where the territory encountered them anymore, which was its own kind of departure. She said her great-grandmother Clara had written, in 1905, that she had prayed for him every year on March the 14th since 1873 and intended to continue, which she did until she died in 1911. She said her grandmother Ruth had kept the practice up through the 1940s. She said she herself had kept it up since Ruth died. The surveyor wrote this down and then looked at what he had written, and then looked at the woman standing in the doorway of the old homestead house with the spring light coming off the Cutter Creek bottomland behind her. He said, "That's 38 years you've been praying for a man you never met." Clara Finch said, "He gave us everything we have. That seems like enough reason." The surveyor drove away down the Cutter Creek Road that afternoon with his photographs and his notes, and the particular feeling, not uncommon in his work but never exactly familiar, of having been allowed briefly into the presence of something that had happened a long time ago and had not yet finished happening. The South Fork Road passed the apple orchard on the way out. 11 of the original trees were in bloom in the early summer light, white flowers against the green of the Wyoming hills, planted by a man who had not forgotten his mother's orchard in Boonville and had carried that memory 400 miles north and put it in the ground, and who had died before he could thank the man who made it possible for it to still be standing. Some debts are paid in full, some are paid forward, some are both at once, and that is when they last.